key was taped to the bottom of our daughter's crib, a tiny brass thing with a worn bow, hidden beneath a strip of medical tape that had yellowed over the months. I found it 6 years before I sat in a corner office on the 42nd floor of a tower in Midtown Manhattan, staring at a spreadsheet that calculated the exact amount of money my in-laws had stolen and the precise interest they now owed me, compounded daily from the day my husband closed his eyes for the last time. By the time I finished what I had started, their entire world would be a smoking crater, their net worth a negative $7.2 million, and I would have a cashier's check for $712,000 folded in my wallet, every cent clawed back from the fraudulent transfer they thought they had buried with my husband's body. This is the story of how a quiet widow with a head for numbers and a heart full of cold rage dismantled a family empire from the inside, using nothing but patience, a lock pick, and the kind of forensic accounting that leaves no stone unturned and no criminal unpunished. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that financial crimes don't just hurt wallets, they destroy entire lives, and the only proper repayment is justice served cold and calculated, with a ledger and a courtroom to back it up. I need to take you back to a beginning that feels like it belongs to another person entirely, a life built on frugality and love, and the kind of quiet sacrifice that never makes it onto a television screen. My name is Lena Vasquez, and I was 34 years old when my husband Danny was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, a cancer so aggressive that the median survival is 15 months from diagnosis, and the treatment, radiation and temozolomide chemotherapy, leaves you hollowed out and lost inside your own skull. But to understand how I became an instrument of financial revenge, you have to understand who I was before the grief. And that story starts in a dingy kitchen in Hayward, California, with a father who could rewire a house blindfolded and a mother who balanced a checkbook like she was balancing a teetering heart. My father, Tomas Vasquez, was a union electrician with Local 595, a man whose hands were calloused and whose face was permanently etched with squint lines from decades of reading blueprints in bad light. He taught me to fish wires through walls when I was 9, to trace a short circuit with a continuity tester when I was 11, and to respect the killing power of a 200-amp service panel before I could drive. The lessons were never formal classroom sessions. They were Saturday mornings spent in other people's basements, my small hands holding a flashlight while he muttered about voltage drop and grounding rods. One Saturday, when I was 12, he let me wire a 3-way switch circuit by myself, a configuration where 2 switches control 1 light, and I got it right on the first try. He didn't say much, just grunted and handed me a candy bar from his lunch pail. That was his way of saying he was proud. But the skill that would later save my life and damn my enemies was the one he never knew he was teaching me. His hobby was restoring antique locks. Our garage was lined with old pin tumbler deadbolts, warded padlocks from the 1920s, and a collection of picks and tension wrenches he had forged himself from the spring steel of broken bandsaw blades. He would sit at his workbench for hours, a bare bulb overhead, his thick fingers surprisingly delicate, manipulating tumblers with a gentle scrape and click. I would pull up a milk crate and watch. He taught me the anatomical vocabulary of a lock, the plug, the Bible, the driver pins, the key pins, the shear line. He showed me how a raking pick could bounce pins into place if you applied the right tension, how a hook pick allowed you to lift each pin individually, how a false set felt when a spool pin caught. By the time I was 16, I could open a standard Schlage in under a minute, and I knew the difference between a spool pin and a serrated pin by the feel of the counter-rotation on the tension wrench. That knowledge never felt sinister. It was just another tool, like the multimeter or the conduit bender, a piece of my father's world that I carried into my own. He passed away from a heart attack when I was 21, on a job site in Stockton, and I never got to show him the woman I became. But I felt his presence every time I held a tension wrench in my fingers, a steadying ghost. My mother, Elena, was the bookkeeper of the household. She worked part-time at a local credit union, and every month she would spread the bills across our kitchen table like a tarot deck, categorizing, reconciling, annotating. She taught me double-entry accounting before I had ever heard the term, using a worn ledger book with columns in green ink. She would say, "Every dollar has a story, Mija, And if the story don't balance, somebody is lying. Those words burrowed into my brain and stayed there, a constant rhythm that would guide my entire career. She created little games for me. She would fabricate a set of fake invoices and bank statements, deliberately inserting a 2-cent error, and time me on how fast I could spot it. At first, it took me 20 minutes, crawling through the numbers line by line. By the time I was 14, I could find the discrepancy in under 60 seconds, a knack that felt almost like a sixth sense, a prickling at the back of my neck when a column didn't foot. She was still alive, living in a small condo in Fremont during the years of my revenge, and I called her every Sunday. I never told her the full scope of what I was doing, but I think she sensed it because she would say, "You sound different, Lena. Focused. Like you used to when you were auditing. Whatever it is, finish it." I put myself through San Jose State by working graveyard shifts at a call center, answering angry phone calls about credit card charges while I memorized the Internal Revenue Code, and I passed all 4 parts of the CPA exam on my first try, a feat that my mother bragged about to every teller at her branch. I took a job in the audit practice at Deloitte right out of college, 3 years of grinding through inventory counts and internal control walkthroughs. And by the time I was 27, I had moved into an internal audit role at a mid-sized cybersecurity firm called Sentinel Networks, where I specialized in fraud investigation. I learned to spot the tiny red flags that most people overlook: a vendor address that matched an employee's home, a string of invoices with sequential numbers just before the quarter close, a signature that was too smooth and too fast, like someone had practiced it in a mirror. My first major case was a procurement fraud scheme. A purchasing manager had set up a shell company and was invoicing Sentinel for imaginary software licenses. I reconstructed his personal bank records, cross-referenced his spending with the invoice dates, and discovered a deposit for a jet ski that coincided exactly with a particularly large fake invoice. He was prosecuted, and I was promoted. I built a reputation as a quiet, relentless terrier who never let go of a discrepancy, and that reputation followed me into the disaster that was about to consume my life. I met Danny at a grubby little startup meetup in a warehouse in Fremont, the kind of event where the beer was warm and the Wi-Fi was spotty, and everyone was pitching the next big thing. Danny Whitfield was not pitching. He was leaning against a wall, drinking a bottle of kombucha and sketching something on a napkin with a ballpoint pen. He had a face that was all sharp angles and soft eyes, and when he looked up and saw me staring, he smiled and said, "I'm designing a payment protocol that could cut cross-border settlement times from 3 days to 3 seconds. Want to hear the math?" Most people would have walked away, but I was a daughter of a man who loved elegant mechanical solutions, and I sat down next to him and listened for 2 hours. He filled the napkin with diagrams of distributed ledgers and zero-knowledge proofs, his voice getting faster and more animated, and I understood maybe half of it, but I understood him. He was the kind of person who saw the world as a system of beautiful, interconnected parts, and he believed he could make them run better. By the end of the night, I had corrected a small error in his interest rate calculation, and he looked at me like I had just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. He turned out to be a brilliant software engineer with a degree from Stanford and a mind that saw patterns in chaos, the kind of person who would forget to eat for 12 hours while he was coding and then apologize by making a batch of lumpy pancakes at 2 in the morning. We started dating, and within a year we were married in a courthouse ceremony on a Tuesday afternoon, with 2 friends as witnesses and a bouquet of grocery store carnations that I still pressed dried in the back of my closet. For our honeymoon, we drove up the coast to Mendocino in my rattling Corolla, the one with the mystery noise, and spent 3 days in a tiny bed and breakfast with a view of the ocean. Danny talked about the future the whole time, a future where PayBridge would transform global finance, where we'd buy a little house with a big workshop for him and an office for me, where our kids would grow up never knowing the sting of poverty. I believed every word, not because I was naive, but because I saw how hard he worked and how much he believed it himself. Together with 2 friends from his Stanford days, Danny co-founded a fintech startup called PayBridge, a platform designed to make cross-border payments as seamless as sending a text message. The early days were brutal and exhilarating. Danny worked 18-hour days in a shared office space that smelled of stale coffee and overheated servers, and he took no salary, just founder's equity that existed only on a stock purchase agreement and a cap table. I carried our household on my $58,000 salary plus overtime, and I learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. We lived in a 500-square-foot apartment in a decaying complex off Zanker Road, a place where the plumbing knocked inside the walls like a distressed heartbeat, and the smell of fried onions from the neighbor's unit seeped through the vents and saturated our clothes. The kitchen counter was so narrow I could barely chop a vegetable, and the bathtub was permanently stained a faint rust brown from decades of hard water. But it was ours, and we made it a home with thrifted furniture and a wall of bookshelves built from reclaimed lumber by my father on a weekend visit. I clipped coupons from the Sunday paper with a level of intensity that bordered on religious fervor, bought our daughter Sophia's clothes from consignment shops and online swap groups, and drove that 15-year-old Corolla with a manual transmission and a mystery rattle that only stopped when the gas tank was exactly half full, a quirk I never bothered to fix because it was cheaper to just keep the tank topped off. I kept a meticulous spreadsheet of every expense, color-coded by category, and I would review it every Sunday night while Danny coded beside me. Our date nights were walks to the taco truck on the corner, and we were happy. Genuinely, completely, bone-deep happy. Danny's equity in PayBridge was valued at just under $300,000 on paper, though the company was pre-revenue and the shares were completely illiquid. We treated that equity like a sacred trust, a promise that we might someday afford a down payment on a tiny house with a yard for Sophia, or a college fund that would shield her from the student loan debt that had haunted my own early adulthood. I never borrowed against it, never counted it in our net worth calculations, not even when we were scraping together change for a can of formula. The documents lived in a fireproof Sentry safe box under our bed, along with Danny's original stock purchase agreement and a spousal consent form I had signed when he joined the company, a standard piece of boilerplate required under California community property law that acknowledged I understood the risk and waived certain rights to the equity in exchange for our family's financial stability. I had read every line of that consent form 3 times, marking sections with a pencil, because my audit training had drilled into me that every signature has a story, and every story has a hidden consequence. I understood the form perfectly. It said that if Danny ever transferred his shares, my signature as his spouse was required to make the transfer legally binding. I filed that knowledge away, never imagining it would become the pivot on which my entire future would turn. When Sophia was born, the joy was so sharp it almost hurt, a tiny human with Danny's eyes and my stubborn chin, who arrived after 22 hours of labor and immediately screamed at the top of her lungs as if she were furious at the world for being too bright. Danny held her in the crook of his arm while he debugged a payment gateway, muttering about API endpoints and secure sockets while she gummed his shirt collar. I went back to work after 8 weeks, my mother flying in to help, and we settled into a rhythm of sleepless nights and whispered arguments about whether we could afford organic baby food and whether Danny's startup would ever make enough money to let me breathe. Those arguments were never truly angry. They were just the friction of 2 exhausted people trying to hold a dream and a family together at the same time. I remember one night, Sophia was crying with an ear infection, and I was trying to soothe her while also balancing the checkbook. Danny came home at 2 in the morning, found me in tears, and just wrapped his arms around both of us. He whispered, "We're going to make it, Lena. I promise you, we're going to make it." Those words would echo in my head later, a cruel reminder of everything that was taken. The Whitfields, Danny's parents and brother, were a distant presence during those years, a Christmas card family that existed in a parallel universe of Greenwich estates and private school tuition that we could never touch. They visited exactly twice during our marriage, and both times Margaret, Danny's mother, managed to make me feel like I was the hired help who had wandered into the living room by mistake. The first visit, she spent the entire time criticizing our apartment. The size, the smell, the location. She said, "Danny, darling, you could do so much better. Your father has connections, you don't have to live like this." Danny, loyal to a fault, just smiled and changed the subject. I smiled too because I was raised to be polite, but I made a mental note. This woman is not your ally. The second visit, when Sophia was 6 months old, Margaret handed me a gift bag that contained a silk blouse 3 sizes too small and said, "I thought you might like something classy for when you finally meet proper society." I thanked her, and later used the blouse as a dust rag. The Whitfields were a different species entirely, a family whose generational wealth had calcified into a kind of smug entitlement that I could never quite fathom. Charles Whitfield, the patriarch, was a retired managing director at a mid-tier investment bank called Merriweather Capital, a man who had built a comfortable fortune on the backs of leveraged buyouts in the 1980s, and now spent his days playing golf, managing his portfolio with a paranoid intensity, and monitoring his sons as if they were underperforming assets. He had grown up wealthy, the son of a textile magnate, and he wore his privilege like a second skin, smooth and unremarkable to himself, but glaringly obvious to everyone else. He was tall, silver-haired, and spoke in a low, measured cadence that sounded like he was dictating a memo, even when he was asking for a glass of water. Margaret was his match in every way, a country club matriarch with icy blonde hair that never moved, a voice that could freeze a room at 50 paces, and a wardrobe of neutral silk blouses that probably cost more than my entire annual salary. She referred to me, to my face, as Danny's little project, and she once suggested, in a tone of helpful concern, that I might consider elocution lessons to smooth out that accent. I had no accent, unless you count the slight California flattening of my vowels, but I knew what she meant. She wanted me to sound like them, to erase every trace of Hayward and my working-class parents, to become a Whitfield in voice if not in blood. Danny's older brother Carter was the golden child, a handsome, charismatically empty man who had failed at 3 separate businesses, a gourmet food truck, a boutique fitness chain, and a mobile app for booking personal stylists, but still managed to drive a leased Maserati and wear suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Carter had been given every advantage: an Ivy League education, a 6-figure trust fund, a network of wealthy contacts. And yet, everything he touched turned to ash. The food truck went bankrupt after 6 months because Carter couldn't be bothered to show up before 11 a.m. The fitness chain collapsed under a mountain of debt because he expanded too fast and hired trainers who were more interested in their own Instagram followings than in client retention. The personal stylist app was a ghost town with 12 users, all of them his wife's friends. Each time a venture failed, Charles would bail him out, restructuring the debt with a combination of personal loans and creative accounting that I now recognize as likely fraudulent. Carter's wife Victoria was a publicist for a stable of minor social media influencers, a woman who could not walk past a reflective surface without checking her angles, and who considered a house without a wine cellar to be a humanitarian crisis. She wore designer clothes with the tags still on, because she returned them after events, and she spoke in a breathy, conspiratorial whisper that made everything sound like a scandal. The 4 of them moved through the world like they owned it, and they looked at me the way you look at a scuff mark on a new pair of shoes. Danny's diagnosis came like a sucker punch on a random Tuesday in March. He had been having headaches that would not quit, a dull throb behind his left eye that gradually intensified until he was wincing in the middle of conversations, and I finally bullied him into seeing a neurologist after he walked directly into a wall one morning while carrying Sophia to her high chair. I will never forget the sound of his shoulder hitting that wall, the way his whole body staggered, how he looked back at me with an expression of bewildered fear that I had never seen on his face before. The MRI took 45 minutes, and the radiologist's face when she came out to speak to us told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. The scan showed a mass the size of a golf ball in his right frontal lobe, a spiderweb of necrosis and swelling, and the biopsy, a needle guided by a stereotactic frame drilled into his skull while he was awake, confirmed the worst possible news. Glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4, the kind of tumor that grows so fast you can almost see it advancing on the follow-up scans. I remember the oncologist, a kind woman with tired eyes and a braid of gray hair, saying the words median survival is 15 months, and then a roaring sound filling my ears so completely that I could not hear the rest of the sentence. Danny sat next to me, his hand cold in mine, and he just nodded slowly, as if someone had told him about a minor delay in a software release. And then he turned to me and said, "Lena, we're going to be okay. You're going to make us okay." I believed him because I had to, because Sophia was 18 months old and just starting to string words together, and I had to go home that night and pretend to be calm while I fed her pureed peas and sang lullabies, Because what else do you do when the floor has dropped out of your universe? That night, after Sophia was asleep, I locked myself in the bathroom and screamed into a towel until my throat was raw. Then I washed my face, went back to Danny, and held his hand while we both pretended to sleep. The Whitfields arrived within 48 hours, descending on our cramped apartment like a flock of well-dressed locusts, their rental SUV blocking the entire driveway and their voices filling the small rooms with a cacophony of unsolicited advice. Margaret swept into my kitchen, dressed in a silk blouse the color of oyster shells that cost more than the refrigerator it leaned against, and began issuing directives about home health aides and second opinions from specialists at Sloan Kettering as if she were planning a corporate retreat. She kept saying things like, "We must be proactive, Danny. We can't leave anything to chance." She didn't ask me what I thought. She never did. Charles took over Danny's affairs with the air of a man who believed that checkbooks healed tumors, pulling out a leather-bound folio and a Mont Blanc pen and asking for a list of passwords and account numbers. He cornered Danny in the bedroom one afternoon, and I heard him through the thin door, his voice dropping into that syrupy paternal register. "Son, we need to get your estate in order. It's the responsible thing to do. Think of Sophia. Think of Lena. If something happens to you, the courts could tie up your assets for years. You don't want them to suffer, do you?" Danny, foggy from the medications, could only murmur his agreement. Carter stood around looking mournful and important, occasionally clapping Danny on the shoulder and saying things like, "You'll beat this, bro, you're a fighter," while Victoria scrolled through her phone on the couch and occasionally interjected with banalities like, "This is just so sad, you guys." I can't even. I was too shattered to fight them, too exhausted to see the sharp angles beneath the smooth surface of their concern, and I let them insert themselves into every aspect of our care while I focused on keeping Danny comfortable and Sophia distracted. Danny underwent a craniotomy to debulk the tumor, a surgery that lasted 6 hours and left a horseshoe-shaped scar above his left ear and a visible dent where the bone flap had been replaced. The aftermath was brutal. He slipped in and out of lucidity like a radio signal fading in a storm, and the combination of steroids to reduce swelling, anti-seizure medications to prevent further brain irritation, and morphine for the pain turned him into a puffy, frightened version of himself I could barely recognize. He would wake up at 3 in the morning, convinced that someone was trying to steal his laptop, or he would forget Sophia's name, and then weep with frustration when he realized what had happened. I slept in a chair next to his hospital bed, a rented contraption in our living room because the apartment doorways were too narrow for a full-sized hospice bed, and I learned to change Roman IV bags and empty catheter bags and administer rescue doses of anti-seizure medication when his pupils would suddenly dilate and he would start to jerk. The hospice nurse, a Haitian woman named Marie, taught me the signs of intracranial pressure spikes, one pupil larger than the other, a sudden drop in heart rate, Cheyne-Stokes breathing that sounded like a machine winding down. She told me gently that when that breathing pattern started, it meant the end was close. I listened to Danny's breathing every night, my ear pressed to his chest, cataloging every inhale, every pause, every rattling exhale, terrified of the silence that would come. One afternoon, about 3 weeks before he died, Charles and a lawyer I had never met before arrived with a stack of documents, a thick sheaf of legal paper bound with a brass fastener. Danny was propped up on pillows, his eyes glassy from the morphine pump that clicked softly at his side, and they told him they needed to protect the pay bridge equity. Charles spoke in soothing, paternal tones about the dangers of probate, the expense of a long court battle if Danny died without a proper trust in place, the risk that creditors, or even I, might inadvertently lose the shares to some legal technicality. He said it was for Sophia's future, for my security, for the legacy Danny had built. I was not there. I was at the pharmacy waiting for a refill of his ondansetron, the anti-nausea medication that was the only thing keeping him from vomiting every meal. There was a long line at the pharmacy that day, a delay that normally would have annoyed me, but that I later came to see as a deliberate piece of cosmic cruelty. By the time I got back, Danny had signed a stock transfer agreement that conveyed all of his pay bridge shares into a revocable living trust with Charles as the sole trustee. I did not learn about this until 2 days later, when Charles offhandedly mentioned it while stirring a cup of Earl Grey tea in my kitchen, as if he were telling me about a new hedge he had planted at Meadowbrook. I felt the floor tilt under me, a physical sensation of vertigo, and when I confronted Danny, he just looked at me with those clouded, morphine-softened eyes and said, "Dad said it would keep you safe, baby. He said you'd never have to worry. I'm sorry, I just wanted to keep you safe." I could not yell at a dying man. I could not do anything but hold his hand and whisper that it was okay, that he did the right thing, and then walk into the bathroom, lock the door, and vomit until my stomach was empty and my throat was raw. I knelt on the cold tile floor and made a silent vow to whatever forces existed in the universe. I would not let them win. I would find a way to honor Danny's trust, even if he had been tricked. Danny died on a foggy Thursday morning in October, holding my hand while Sophia napped in the next room, her breath soft on the baby monitor. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the apartment and left me gasping. I watched the color drain from his face, the life leaving his eyes, and I felt a part of myself go with him, a cord cut that I knew would never fully heal. That silence lasted less than 24 hours. Carter and Victoria arrived the next afternoon, ostensibly to help with the funeral arrangements, but within minutes Carter was in Danny's tiny office, a converted walk-in closet with a folding table and a stacked pair of monitors, throwing things into cardboard boxes he had brought, labeled donate and trash with broad black marker strokes. I watched from the doorway, my body still heavy with the shock of fresh grief, as he tossed old code notebooks, conference swag from tech meetups, a half-finished prototype of a hardware wallet Danny had been tinkering with, and a small mahogany box with a brass lock plate into the donate pile without even opening it, the box landing with a thud against a stack of outdated JavaScript manuals. "Just clearing out the junk, Lena," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, the kind of smile that salespeople give you right before they upsell you on the extended warranty. "Too much clutter around here. Not healthy for you or the baby. You need a fresh start." Something about the way he avoided looking at that box, the way his gaze skittered away from it like a stone skipping on water, made the back of my neck go cold. I nodded, played the dazed widow, let my voice go soft and halting, and waited until they left for the night, the door clicking shut behind them, before I crawled into the pile and fished the box out from under a heap of old t-shirts, VHS tapes, and a broken webcam. My fingers recognized the wood instantly. It was the same mahogany my father had used on his lock restoration projects, a deep red-brown with a tight, even grain. Danny must have commissioned it or made it himself, a little keepsake for something precious. I held it to my chest, feeling the faint warmth of the wood, and knew that whatever was inside, it was meant for me. The box was heavy for its size, about 6 inches long and 4 inches wide, made of a dark wood that smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something like the inside of my father's lock collection. The lock was a simple warded brass mechanism, the kind you could open with a bent paperclip if you knew where to press the internal wards, and I did not have to, because I remembered the key. Weeks before he died, during a rare moment of clarity when the steroids had temporarily pushed back the fog, Danny had pressed a tiny brass key into my palm, his fingers trembling with the kind of fine tremor that never fully went away after the surgery. He had whispered, "For our girl. Hide it where only you would look. Promise me you'll keep it safe." I had not understood at the time, thought maybe it was to a safety deposit box I had forgotten about, one of those things busy couples set up and then never mention again. But something in his voice, a note of desperate urgency, had made me take it seriously, and that very night, after he had fallen into a fitful sleep, I had taped it to the underside of Sophia's crib, beneath a strip of medical tape that blended perfectly with the white wood. I had tested the hiding spot. The tape was flush, the key didn't rattle, and the crib's skirt made it invisible from any angle. I knew no one would ever think to search there, not the Whitfields, not the hospice nurses, not the landlord. That was the first strategic decision I made in what would become a 6-year campaign, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was just following Danny's instructions, the last coherent request he ever made. That night, alone in the silent apartment with Sophia asleep in the next room, I retrieved the key from its hiding place, the tape peeling away with a soft ripping sound. I opened the box and found a small stack of love letters I had written to Danny during the early days of our relationship, the paper soft and worn from being folded and unfolded many times, a pressed gardenia from our wedding, its petals now a translucent brown, and a single sheet of paper folded into a tight square. I unfolded it with shaking hands, my tears already blurring my vision. The handwriting was Danny's, but it was ragged and uneven, the letters slanting like a drunk person's handwriting, as if he had written it in great pain or great hurry, maybe during one of those brief windows when the medication allowed him to surface from the haze. It said, "Lena, if you are reading this, it means I could not stop them. The papers they made me sign are wrong. I recorded everything. There is a USB drive in the lining of my old guitar case in the closet. Do not trust them. Save yourself and our girl. I am so sorry. I love you more than I ever found the words to say." I read that note 7 times, my tears dripping onto the paper and smearing the ink, the words dissolving and reforming as I tried to process the magnitude of what he was telling me. By the 7th time, the grief had transmuted into something harder and colder, something that felt a lot like the resolve I used to feel when I found a material misstatement in an audit work paper and knew I had to follow the trail to its source, no matter where it led. I recognized that feeling. It was the cold, analytical detachment of a forensic accountant who has smelled blood in the water. I wiped my face on my sleeve, the rough fabric scratching my skin, and I went to the closet. The guitar case was battered, black, with a peeling Our Lady of Guadalupe sticker on the back, a gift from my mother on our wedding day. Danny had not touched it since Sophia was born. I carried it to the kitchen table, my movements robotic, and using a kitchen knife, I sliced open the velvet lining along the seam, the fabric parting with a soft rending sound. There, wrapped in a scrap of velvet the color of a bruised plum, was a USB drive the size of my thumb. It was a Kingston Data Traveler, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, completely unremarkable, and yet it held the power to overturn everything. I plugged it into my laptop that night, the screen's glow the only light in the room, and found a single video file, an MP4 with a timestamp from 2 weeks before his death. In the video, Danny was sitting in his hospital bed, the blinds drawn behind him to block the afternoon sun that gave him headaches. His face was puffy from the steroids, his eyes tired but alert, and his voice was a whisper, as if he was afraid of being overheard even though we were alone. He explained that Charles and the lawyer, a man named David Breslow from a firm in Stamford, had pressured him into signing the stock transfer while he was heavily medicated, assuring him that it was a routine estate planning measure. But later, when he had a moment of clarity, he realized something was wrong. The document they kept pushing was not a standard trust. It was an irrevocable conveyance that would strip me of any right to the shares. When he questioned it, Charles had become angry, telling him he was confused, that he didn't understand the legal complexities. Danny realized that they had deliberately isolated him during a vulnerable moment, refusing to let me be present because they knew I would smell a rat from a mile away. So he stalled. He told them he needed the spousal consent form, the one that was supposed to have my signature notarized, and he pretended to wait for it. But they had already prepared a forgery, and he knew they would backdate it. In the video, he held up a separate document, a sworn affidavit he had notarized with the help of a hospice volunteer who had come by one afternoon when the family was out. The volunteer, a retired notary public named Agnes, had witnessed his signature and his mental state, and she had stamped the document without asking questions, just a quiet act of rebellion against a family she saw as vultures. The affidavit stated clearly that the stock transfer was obtained under duress, that his cognitive function was impaired by medication, and that he revoked any authority he might have inadvertently granted. The affidavit was on the USB drive, along with a scanned copy of the original stock purchase agreement, a chain of emails between Charles and Breslow discussing the transfer before Danny had even agreed to it, and a copy of the forged spousal consent form he had managed to photograph with his phone. He must have snuck the phone when they weren't looking, a small victory of his fading mind. He ended the video by looking directly into the camera, his eyes suddenly fierce, and saying, "Lena, you're the smartest person I know. You can fix this. I believe in you." I shut the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the distant sound of traffic on the 880, the occasional roar of a semi downshifting on the overpass, and I made a vow, a cold, silent promise to the ghost of the man I loved, that I would not rest until every person who betrayed him was reduced to financial rubble. The next morning, the vultures circled closer, their patience exhausted by my fog of grief. Charles summoned me to a meeting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had clipped coupons, and balanced our checkbook for years, with Carter and Victoria flanking him like a pair of expensive bookends. He laid out a tidy little plan, printed on heavy bond paper with the Merriweather capital letterhead at the top, a document that felt thick and expensive in my hands. The plan was simple. I would sign over our apartment lease, which was technically in Danny's name but co-signed by Charles, and I would also sign a release of any and all claims to the Pay Bridge equity, acknowledging that the transfer into the trust was valid and binding. In exchange, they would allow me and Sophia to live in the guest house on their Greenwich estate, rent-free, so that I could get back on my feet and focus on being a mother. The language was all faux compassion and iron control, full of phrases like for the benefit of the child and in the best interest of the family unit, and it made my skin crawl. Charles kept his eyes fixed on me, unblinking, a predator assessing the weakness of his prey. Carter leaned in, his expensive cologne filling my nostrils, and said, "Look, Lena, you're a mess right now. I mean that in the kindest way. You're barely holding it together. Let us handle the complicated money stuff. We'll take care of you, make sure you and the little one don't want for anything." Victoria added, her voice dripping with insincere sympathy, "Just think of it as a fresh start, sweetie. A chance to heal. You wouldn't want to be alone out here, would you? All that stress, it's not good for a new mother." I looked at their faces, at the barely concealed hunger underneath the sympathy, the way Charles's eyes flicked to the papers, and back to me with the kind of anticipation a gambler feels when the roulette wheel slows down, and I did the only thing I could do. I played the part. I had spent years in high-stakes audit interviews, keeping a poker face while a CFO sweated through his shirt, and I channeled every ounce of that training now. I let my eyes fill with tears, let my shoulders slump, and I said in a small, shaky voice, the voice of a woman who has been shattered and has no fight left in her, "I just need a little time. I can't think straight. Please, just a few weeks." I can barely remember to feed myself. I let a sob catch in my throat, not a loud one, just a little hitch of breath that sounded utterly defeated. They exchanged glances, a silent conversation of raised eyebrows and minute shrugs, and Charles gave a magnanimous nod that made his jowls wobble. "Of course, my dear, take all the time you need. We're family. We wouldn't dream of rushing you." I knew then, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that they were already moving pieces on the board, and I needed to let them think I was a passive pawn while I positioned myself for the kill. They moved me and Sophia out of that apartment within 3 days. The speed was dizzying, designed to prevent me from thinking clearly. A crew of movers, hired by Charles, packed our meager belongings into cardboard boxes, and I watched my home of 5 years dismantled in hours. I was allowed to keep some things. Sophia's crib, my clothes, a few boxes of books. The rest, they said, would be stored for me, though I never saw any of it again. Before we left, I made sure to retrieve the fireproof box from under the bed, the one with Danny's original stock purchase agreement, and I slipped it into a suitcase among Sophia's baby blankets. It was a risk, but a calculated one. They never searched my bags. We drove across the country to Connecticut in the back of a rented black Escalade with tinted windows, the landscape shifting from the brown hills of California to the flat plains of the Midwest to the dense green forests of New England. Charles had hired a driver, a silent man in a black suit who never looked at me, and I was left to my thoughts. During the drive, I was quiet, staring out the window while Sophia dozed in her car seat, but my mind was racing. I was cataloging everything: the route we took, the credit cards Charles used for gas, the way Carter and Victoria bickered about a missed payment on the Maserati lease in hushed tones while they thought I was asleep. I heard Victoria say, "Your father can't keep bailing us out forever, Carter. If this restaurant thing doesn't work, we're done." Carter snapped back, "It's not a restaurant, it's a private chef placement service, and it will work. Dad just needs to see the numbers." The numbers? I filed that phrase away. By the time we rolled through the ornate iron gates of Meadowbrook, the Whitfield estate, I had a mental map of their financial fault lines, and I was already laying the groundwork for the most devastating audit of my entire life. The guest house at Meadowbrook was a converted carriage house set back behind a row of towering elm trees that creaked in the wind, a 2-story structure with a kitchenette that smelled of old varnish, 2 small bedrooms, and a persistent draft that whispered through the window frames and stirred the dust motes in the slant of afternoon light. It was perfectly positioned for surveillance. From my kitchen window, I could see the back entrance to the main house, the 6-car garage where Charles kept his vintage Jaguar collection under custom car covers, and the flagstone pathway that led to the home office Charles used as his private command center, a separate wing connected by a covered breezeway. The landscaping was immaculate, boxwood hedges trimmed into perfect spheres, but there was a small gap in the hedge near the office window, just wide enough for a person to crouch behind without being seen from the house. I noted that gap immediately, like a field agent mapping an escape route. I made myself small and forgettable. I wore baggy sweaters in neutral colors, no makeup, my hair pulled back in a sloppy ponytail, and I spoke in a soft, distracted voice, trailing off mid-sentence as if I had lost my train of thought. I let everyone assume I was barely functional, a broken woman just going through the motions of caring for her daughter, and I watched. I watched the comings and goings of the household staff, a housekeeper named Dolores who arrived at 7:30 sharp every weekday, a groundskeeper who mowed the vast lawns on Thursdays, a private chef who prepared meals in the main kitchen 3 times a week. I learned the rhythms of the house, the times when the staff left, the way Charles disappeared into his office every morning at exactly 10 o'clock and emerged at noon looking haggard and red-faced, the way Victoria's Mercedes convertible was absent every Wednesday afternoon during her standing appointment at a spa in town. I made notes in a small spiral notebook, using a cipher I invented based on accounting codes, a simple substitution that would look like a shopping list if anyone found it. Eggs might mean Charles' office 10 a.m. Milk might mean Carter shouting about money. I kept the notebook tucked into the lining of my diaper bag, behind the changing pad, and I never let it out of my sight. The isolation was a control tactic, I knew that. Margaret would occasionally stop by the guest house with a casserole or a basket of fruit, her visits always timed to check on whether I was settling in, and she would drop little comments meant to erode my confidence. "It must be so hard for you, Lena, coming from such a modest background. Don't worry, we'll help you adjust to a more refined environment." Or, "I hope you're not overthinking the finances, dear. Charles is a professional. He knows what's best for everyone." She would glance around the guest house, her eyes cataloging the meager furniture, the lack of decor, and I could see the satisfaction in her expression. I was exactly where she wanted me, dependent, isolated, and seemingly broken. I would smile wanly and say thank you, and when she left, I would pull out my notebook and note the times, the exact phrasing, and any financial details I had overheard. Once, I overheard her on the phone in the garden, just outside my window. She was talking to a friend from the country club, and she said, "Oh, the daughter-in-law? She's nothing, just a little mouse from California. We're taking care of her, of course. Poor thing can barely function. We'll get everything sorted out, don't you worry." The venom in her voice was so casual, so practiced, that it sent a shiver down my spine. I noted the date and time, and I filed it away. About a month after we arrived, a small household crisis gave me my first real opportunity to test their perceptions of me and to establish a legend that would cover my future actions. A violent thunderstorm rolled through Fairfield County one Saturday evening, the kind of storm that turns the sky a bruised purple and sends tree branches crashing onto the slate roof of the main house. The power flickered and then died, plunging the guest house into darkness. Sophia was asleep, thank God, but I could hear Victoria shrieking from the main house about her hair dryer and the fact that the circuit breaker had tripped and no one knew how to fix it. The staff was off for the weekend. Charles and Margaret were at a charity gala in Manhattan, and Carter and Victoria, who were staying in the main house while their own apartment in the city was being renovated, were utterly helpless. I heard Carter shouting into his phone at someone, probably the groundskeeper, demanding that he drive in from his home in Stamford in the middle of the storm to fix a breaker. The groundskeeper was not answering, because he was a sensible man who did not drive in thunderstorms for people who paid him late. I pulled on a raincoat, tucked a flashlight into my pocket, and walked across the wet flagstones to the main house, the rain pelting my face and the wind tearing at my hood. I knocked on the back door and Carter answered, his face a mask of irritation and panic. "What do you want, Lena? We're kind of busy here." I kept my voice soft, distant. I thought I could help. My dad was an electrician. He stared at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Whatever, just fix it. The alarm is going to start beeping soon." I found the basement door off the kitchen, a heavy old oak thing with a wrought iron handle, and I descended the narrow stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dust. The basement smelled of mildew and old coal, a remnant of the house's original heating system, and I located the main electrical panel, a vintage 200-amp square D unit with its cover hanging open and the main breaker tripped into the off position. I knew this panel intimately. My father had trained me on a nearly identical unit in our garage, drilling me on the sequence of branch circuits and the importance of never bridging a fuse with a penny, a lesson he had imparted with a story about a house fire that had killed a family in his hometown. I pushed the main breaker back into the on position with a satisfying clunk, the house groaning as power surged back through the wires, and I climbed the stairs to find Carter standing at the top, his face a mixture of annoyance and genuine bafflement. "How did you know how to do that?" he asked, his tone suspicious. I just shrugged and said in my softest, most distant voice, "My dad was an electrician. I guess some things stick." I saw something flicker in his eyes then, a faint unease, a flicker of something that might have been fear, but I smiled vaguely and walked back to the guest house, the rain soaking through my shoes. That moment was important because it established me, in their minds, as a harmless savant with a few blue-collar skills, a woman who could fix a toaster but could not balance a checkbook, and no threat whatsoever. It also gave me the cover I needed later, because when I started leaving the guest house at odd hours, I could always say I was just heading to the basement to check the panel if anyone saw me. I was building the infrastructure for my investigation, one carefully placed brick at a time. The real investigation began in earnest a few weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late November, when Charles was hosting a business lunch at the Greenwich Country Club, and the rest of the household was scattered to the winds. Margaret had a charity board meeting. Carter was supposedly at a meeting with potential investors for his failing concierge business, Whitfield privileged, and Victoria was at her spa. The staff, Dolores the housekeeper and the groundskeeper, had both been given the day off for some reason. Charles had mentioned it at breakfast the day before, something about annual inspections that required the house to be empty. I had noted it in my cipher. "Two's empty." The day was cold and clear, the sky a pale, brittle blue, and I knew I would never get a better window of opportunity. I left Sophia with a neighbor, a retired librarian named Mrs. Chatterjee, who lived in a cottage just outside the estate's perimeter wall, a kind woman with a soft voice and a collection of picture books that Sophia adored. Mrs. Chatterjee had become my one true ally on the outside, a person who asked no questions and simply provided a safe harbor. I told her I had some errands to run, and she smiled and said, "Take your time, dear. I'll be reading Goodnight Moon 40 times anyway." I hugged Sophia, inhaling the baby's shampoo smell of her hair, and then I walked back to the guest house to prepare. I had prepared a tool bag, purchased from a hardware store in town with cash, and I had assembled it over several trips to avoid drawing attention. Inside the bag were a pair of needle-nose pliers, a voltage tester, a small digital camera with a zoom lens and 32 GB of storage, and a set of lock picks I had kept since a community college locksmithing course I took on a whim during a summer when I was 19. The picks were handmade, bent steel with wooden handles worn smooth from years of my father's hands, and then my own, and they included a tension wrench, a rake pick for quick bypasses, and a short hook for single pin picking. I also carried a small flashlight with a red lens filter to preserve my night vision, a leather-bound notebook, and a set of thin latex gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints on anything that might later be examined. I packed the bag with the same care. My father used to pack his tool belt, checking each item twice, and then I slipped into my bulky winter coat, the one that made me look shapeless and harmless, and I walked toward the main house. I knew the home office was locked with a basic quickset pin tumbler deadbolt, the kind that takes 5 standard pins and offers no security whatsoever against anyone with 15 minutes of practice and a steady hand. I had scoped it out on a previous, helpful visit to fix a leaky faucet in the nearby powder room, noting the model number on the faceplate. I also knew, from my months of observation, that the security system, a temperamental old Brinks BHS 4000 panel from the early 2000s, ran on the house's main electrical circuit and had no battery backup in the event of a breaker trip. The system was old and glitchy, and the Whitfields had never bothered to upgrade it because they believed, wrongly, that the sheer presence of an alarm sign in the yard was enough to deter any intrusion. I had verified this by tripping the security breaker once before, very early one morning when everyone was asleep, and noting that the panel downstairs went dark and stayed dark for a full 30 seconds before I flipped the breaker back on. No alarm sounded, no one woke up, and the system simply rebooted with a soft chime that was barely audible from the guest house. That test had been a risk, but a necessary one. Now I knew the system's vulnerability as intimately as a lover. That Tuesday, I walked over to the main house with my tool bag under my winter coat, the coat bulky and shapeless, the kind of thing a grieving widow would wear without a thought to fashion. I entered through the back kitchen door, which was never locked during the day because the staff came and went, and I made my way to the basement stairs. The basement was dark and cold, the floor uneven flagstones, and I located the breaker box, shining my flashlight with the red filter to avoid a white beam that might be seen through the windows. I flipped the breaker labeled Security System to the off position. The label was typed on a Dymo label maker, slightly crooked, as if the electrician who installed it was in a hurry. I waited 5 seconds, listening to the silence of the house, and then I climbed the back stairs, a narrow servant's staircase that led directly to the office wing. The back stairs were dusty, unused, and they gave me cover from any unexpected arrivals. At the office door, I knelt and examined the lock. It was a standard quickset, as I had suspected, with no anti-pick pins, no security spools, just a straightforward 5-pin cylinder. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied light rotational pressure with my index finger. The wrench was a thin piece of spring steel, bent at a right angle, and I could feel the subtle resistance of the pins. I worked the rake pick in and out with a gentle scrubbing motion, listening for the telltale click of each driver pin setting into place. The first pin clicked almost immediately. The second gave a little resistance, then set with a soft snick. The third was springy, bouncing back until I eased off the tension slightly. The fourth pin was stubborn, giving a false set that made the plug rotate slightly and then stop, a telltale sign of a spool pin. I had not expected a spool in a cheap quickset, but sometimes manufacturers mix them in. I switched to the short hook, carefully lifting the fourth pin while maintaining light tension, feeling the counter-rotation of the plug as the spool's thin waist aligned with the shear line. It set with a satisfying thunk, and the fifth pin followed easily. The cylinder turned with a smooth, satisfying rotation, and the deadbolt slid back. I was inside in under 20 seconds, my heart hammering in my chest but my hands steady, the old muscle memory taking over. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and something metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike, the scent of money and paranoia. I locked the door behind me from the inside, using the thumb turn, just in case someone came by and tried the knob. The office was a large, wood-paneled room with a massive mahogany desk, a wall of legal books that looked like they had never been opened, and a bay window that overlooked the back lawn. A portrait of Charles, rendered in oils, hung above the fireplace, his silver hair gleaming under a layer of varnish. The most important feature, from my perspective, was the filing cabinet, a heavy 4-drawer steel case unit in a dark gray finish, with a warded lock that was even simpler than the door. I pulled out my set of skeleton keys, one of which I had filed down years ago to fit generic office furniture locks, a trick my father had taught me when I complained about losing the key to an old filing cabinet at Sentinel Networks. I inserted the skeleton key, jiggled it gently until I felt the internal ward engage, and the lock turned with a soft click that was almost musical. I pulled open the second drawer, the one that would be at eye level for a man of Charles's height, and I began my search. The drawers were organized with the meticulous, almost obsessive precision of a man who had spent decades in high finance and viewed chaos as a personal failing. Folders were labeled with acronyms and dates in a precise block lettering that I recognized from the Christmas card envelopes they sent every year. I worked my way through the folders methodically, photographing every page with the digital camera, the shutter clicking softly in the silence. The camera had a macro setting that allowed me to capture sharp images of fine print, and I made sure to get the full context of each document: headers, footers, signatures, dates. About halfway through the second drawer, I found a thick manila folder, heavier than the others, marked Paybridge Trust Confidential in red ink. My blood went cold and hot at the same time, a flush that started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. I pulled it out and spread the contents on the floor, kneeling on the oriental rug. There was the stock transfer agreement, signed by Danny in a handwriting that did not quite look like his. The loops of the D and the Y too thick and wobbly, as if someone had guided his hand while he was barely conscious. The ink was slightly smeared on the last page, as if a sleeve had dragged across it before it dried. It was notarized by a notary named Patricia Drummond, whose seal I had never seen before. I photographed the seal, making sure to capture the notary ID number. There was a spousal consent form, supposedly signed by me, with a signature that was a clumsy forgery. I have analyzed thousands of signatures in my career as an auditor, and I knew within 3 seconds that this was not my handwriting. The slant was wrong, the pressure uniform where mine varies, and the final loop of my surname, Vasquez, was drawn with a flourish that I never use. In my natural signature, the Z trails off into a simple horizontal line. On this forgery, it looped back on itself like a corkscrew. I photographed it from multiple angles, making sure to capture the grain of the paper and the indentation of the pen strokes. But the real kill shot was the notary seal on that forged consent. The date next to the seal was October 15th, 3 full days after Danny had died. A notary cannot notarize a dead man's signature. That single date made the entire document legally void, and it was also a felony, a Class D felony in Connecticut, punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. I could feel the weight of that date settle into my brain like a stone dropping into a pond. I imagined myself presenting this in a courtroom, watching the defense attorney's face crumble as the jury did the math. 3 days after death. It was so brazen, so stupid, that it almost made me laugh. Behind the trust documents, I found a thinner folder containing bank statements from a private wealth management firm called Capstone Global Trust, based in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. The statements showed an account with a balance of just over $400,000, deposited approximately 6 months after Danny's death, in a series of wire transfers that originated from a commercial bank in Stamford. I traced the originating wire transfer back, using the reference numbers on the statement, cross-referencing with a separate loan document I found in the next folder, and I pieced together the following. Charles had used the stolen Pay Bridge shares as collateral for a leveraged loan from Stamford Commercial Bank, a loan issued in the name of the Whitfield Family Trust, with himself as the signatory. He had then funneled the loan proceeds into the Cayman account, and from there, the money had flowed into a series of shell companies, one of which I recognized from a previous overheard argument was the corporate entity behind Carter's failing luxury concierge business, Whitfield Privileged. The business was hemorrhaging cash so fast that the bank statements showed withdrawals of $50,000, $70,000, $100,000 at a time, all in the pursuit of a doomed venture that offered on-demand private jet charters and personal shopping services to a clientele that mostly existed in Carter's imagination. I found an invoice for a brand consultant who had charged $60,000 for a logo redesign and a lease agreement for a Manhattan office space that cost $20,000 a month and was described in an email as mainly a place for Carter to nap. The sheer scale of the waste was staggering, but it was also useful. Every dollar of waste was a dollar I could trace back to the fraudulent loan. On top of that, I found a separate folder in the bottom drawer, hidden behind tax returns from the 1990s, that contained credit card statements in my name, Claudia Vasquez. The statements were from 3 different premium card issuers, Amex Platinum, Chase Sapphire Reserve, and a British Airways Visa signature, with charges I had never made. A $16,000 charge at a jewelry store in Palm Beach, a $9,000 catering bill for a party in the Hamptons, a series of first-class flights to London and Paris that I had certainly never taken. The billing address on all of them was the guest house at Meadowbrook, which meant the mail was being intercepted before I saw it, probably by Dolores on Margaret's instructions. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. They had opened accounts in my name, used my social security number, which they had access to from Danny's estate documents, and they had run up over $200,000 in debt, then defaulted on the payments, leaving my credit in ruins. I pulled my own credit report on my phone later that week, using a free service I accessed through a secured VPN, and I confirmed that my credit score had dropped from a near-perfect 780 to 490, a ruinous number that would prevent me from renting an apartment, buying a car, or even opening a checking account without a co-signer. I was being set up as the scapegoat for their entire debt spiral, a financial patsy who would take the fall while they continued to live their gilded lives. The audacity of it, the sheer, brazen cruelty, made the edges of my vision go white for a moment, a flare of rage so hot I had to close my eyes and breathe through my nose until my hands stopped shaking. I carefully replaced all the folders exactly as I had found them, using the photographs I had taken as a guide to the original order, and I relocked the filing cabinet. Before I left the office that day, my eye caught the wastebasket next to Charles's desk, a brass-lined leather bin that looked like an antique but was probably a reproduction. It was filled with shredded paper, long, thin strands from a cross-cut shredder, the kind that turns a page into a pile of confetti. In my auditing days, I had been trained in document reconstruction techniques, using a light table and transparent tape to piece together shredded documents when fraud was suspected. The process is painstaking and tedious, but it is remarkably effective if you have patience and good lighting. I bagged the entire contents of the wastebasket in a large Ziploc bag I had brought for this purpose, the remnants rustling like dead leaves, and I carried it back to the guest house under my coat, my heart still hammering but my mind already mapping out the reconstruction process. I had Sophia to pick up from Mrs. Chatterjee, so I stashed the bag behind the guest house washing machine and spent the afternoon being a mother, pushing Sophia on the swing set, reading her board books, pretending to be normal. That night, after Sophia was asleep in her crib, her breath slow and even, I cleared the kitchen table and began the painstaking work of reassembling the shreds. I had brought a roll of Scotch tape, a stack of blank printer paper, and a small battery-powered LED lamp that I positioned to shine at a low angle, which highlights the edges of the paper and makes it easier to distinguish the direction of the cut marks. I sorted the shreds by color first, separating the white office paper from the light blue of carbon copy forms and the pale yellow of legal pads. Then I sorted by paperweight, feeling the thickness between my thumb and forefinger, because different documents often use different stock. Then I looked for printed text, grouping shreds that contained similar fonts, similar margins, similar letter sizes. The process was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where every piece was a rectangle and the picture was a nightmare. It took me 4 hours, my back aching and my eyes burning, but by midnight, I had reconstructed a half-dozen key pages, taping them carefully onto the blank paper and photographing the results. One reconstructed page was a draft of a letter from Charles to the loan officer at Stamford Commercial Bank, demanding the release of additional funds against the Pay Bridge equity, with language that explicitly acknowledged the shares were obtained through a legal transfer from the deceased's estate and were free of any encumbrances from the surviving spouse. The phrase, "free of any encumbrances," was a lie, of course, but it was a lie that Charles had put in writing, a smoking gun that directly contradicted the forged spousal consent form and proved he knew I existed and was deliberately circumventing my rights. Another reconstructed page was an email printout between Charles and David Breslow, the lawyer, discussing how to handle the Vasquez problem once the dust settles, and they could have me declared financially incompetent and stripped of any executor rights. The email suggested petitioning a probate court for a conservatorship, using my supposed emotional instability as grounds, and then moving me and Sophia into a smaller property they owned in upstate New York, a cabin with no phone service and a single dirt road access, where I would be isolated and dependent and utterly under their control. They even had a timeline, 6 to 8 months post-move-in, once she's fully discredited in the eyes of the court. The cold, clinical language of those emails, the way they discussed me as a liability to be managed rather than a human being, made my stomach turn, but it also sharpened my resolve to a razor's edge. I taped that page especially carefully, as if the tape itself were a form of justice. I spent the next several weeks deepening my investigation, using the cover of my foggy widow persona to move unnoticed through the household. I fixed a broken garbage disposal in the main kitchen when the chef was out, impressing Margaret with my handy skills and earning a small measure of trust that let me linger in the kitchen and overhear conversations. I volunteered to reorganize the pantry, giving me an excuse to be near the back hallway where Charles made private phone calls. The pantry had a thin wall that shared a vent with the hallway, and I could hear him clearly through it, his voice muffled but distinct. I listened as he argued with creditors, his voice rising and falling with panic and anger. I heard him say things like, "The collateral is solid, it's just a liquidity issue, and Carter's business just needs another injection and it will turn the corner. And we cannot let the bank call in the note. Do you understand me? We cannot." I heard him use a phrase, "the Vasquez dummy accounts," when talking about the credit cards, and my blood ran cold. I wrote down every date, every phrased number, and I cross-referenced them against the documents I had photographed. One afternoon, while Margaret was at her book club and the house was quiet, I slipped into Charles's office a second time, this time using a different tactic. I had noticed that the cleaning staff left the window in the breezeway unlocked, a small casement window that opened into the office from the side. I had verified this on a previous reconnaissance walk, pretending to look for a lost toy for Sophia. I was able to reach it by climbing onto a stone bench in the garden, and I wiggled through, dropping softly onto the rug inside. This time, I focused on his computer. I was not a hacker, but I knew enough about security from my time at Sentinel Networks to know that most people's passwords are hilariously predictable. I tried the desk drawer where I had seen him keep a small notebook, and I found a list of passwords written in his block lettering. Meadowbrook 1952 for the main login, Whitfield Trust 99 for his bank portal. I did not log in. I did not want to leave any digital trace, because a login timestamp could alert him. Instead, I photographed the password list, and I also found a backup external hard drive in a locked drawer of his desk, a drawer I opened with one of my skeleton keys. The drive was a Western Digital, my passport, silver and unremarkable. It was not encrypted, a stunning lapse for a man who thought he was so clever. When I later connected it to my own laptop in the guest house, using a USB adapter I had purchased with cash, I found a treasure trove of financial records. QuickBooks files for Carter's business, showing systematic cash bleed and a dozen payments to a consultant, who was clearly fictional. PDFs of loan agreements with multiple banks, many of them cross-collateralized with assets that did not exist, and a folder labeled Estate Planning that contained a scanned copy of a forged power of attorney document granting Charles full control over my financial affairs, supposedly signed by me on a date when I was in California, 3,000 miles away. This document had my forged signature again, the same corkscrew, Z, and a notary stamp from the same notary, Patricia Drummond, who I had already identified as the backdater. I photographed everything and stored the images on an encrypted folder on my laptop, behind a password that was 40 characters long and completely random. I also made a backup copy on a second USB drive, the same model as Danny's, and I hid it in the guest house behind a loose baseboard in the bathroom, a trick my father had taught me for hiding valuables in old houses. The ally came to me in the form of a phone call on a cold January morning, 3 months into my stay at Meadowbrook. I was in the guest house kitchen, warming a bottle for Sophia, when my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I almost declined the call, but something, maybe the instincts of an auditor who never ignored a lead, made me answer. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, a woman with the faintest trace of a Nigerian accent. She introduced herself as Diane Okonkwo, a senior vice president in the Special Assets Division of Stamford Commercial Bank. She explained that she was reviewing the loan file associated with the Pay Bridge Trust as part of a routine regulatory audit, an audit triggered by an anonymous whistleblower complaint from inside the bank. She said, "Mrs. Vasquez, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you ever signed a spousal consent form for a stock transfer related to your late husband's equity?" I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my voice steady. "No," I said. "I have never signed any such document." She paused, and I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. "And were you present when your husband signed the stock transfer agreement that placed his shares into a trust controlled by Charles Whitfield?" "No," I said. "I was at a pharmacy picking up medication. I was not informed the transfer was happening." Another pause. "Do you have any knowledge of a loan being taken out against those shares, or of any bank accounts opened in your name?" I took a deep breath, and I made a decision. "Ms. Okonkwo," I said, "I have evidence that my signature was forged, that the notary date was falsified, and that my credit has been destroyed by accounts opened fraudulently in my name. I have been gathering this evidence for months, and I am willing to share it with you if you can assure me that it will be used to initiate a full fraud investigation and that my daughter and I will be protected." There was a long silence, and then Diane said, in a voice that was suddenly much quieter and more intense, "Mrs. Vasquez, what you're describing is a textbook case of equity stripping, elder financial abuse, and wire fraud. This bank takes such allegations very seriously. If what you say is true, and I have seen enough red flags in this file to believe it is, the bank will cooperate fully with federal investigators. But I need you to provide me with the evidence you've gathered, and I need you to stay alive and unharmed until this goes to a grand jury. Do you understand the danger you might be in?" She paused, and I heard a door close on her end, as if she had moved to a private office. "These people are desperate, Mrs. Vasquez. I've seen men like Charles Whitfield before. They don't go down easily. If they suspect you're onto them, they could become violent." I looked at Sophia, who was now toddling around the kitchen with a stuffed bunny, and I said, "I understand perfectly. Tell me how to get the files to her." She gave me a secure file transfer protocol link, an encrypted portal used by the bank for sensitive documents, and that night I uploaded everything. The photographs of the forged signature and the backdated notary seal, the reconstructed shredded documents, the QuickBooks records showing the cash drain, the email printout discussing the conservatorship, and most importantly, the USB drive from Danny's guitar case, with the video and the affidavit. I sent it all in a single encrypted zip file, protected by a password that I gave her over a separate voice call. She confirmed receipt, and then she gave me a phone number for a special agent at the FBI's New Haven field office, a woman named Agent Sarah Chen, who she said was already aware of the case and waiting for my call. I met Agent Chen in a small diner off I-95 2 days later, a place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. She was a compact woman with short black hair and a no-nonsense expression, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad. At the end, she closed the pad and said, "Ms. Vasquez, we've been building a case against Charles Whitfield for 18 months, based on a pattern of suspicious loan activity and some whistleblower tips from former employees of his bank. Your evidence is the final piece we needed. We have warrants ready to go, but we need to time this perfectly. I'm asking you to continue your current behavior for a few more weeks while we secure the necessary coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office. You will be in no danger if you remain careful, but I need you to understand that this is a criminal investigation, and your testimony will be crucial. Are you willing to testify?" I said yes without hesitation, and I felt a strange, tingling clarity wash over me, the same clarity I used to feel when I finally found the smoking gun in a fraud audit and knew that the long, grinding work was about to pay off. Agent Chen handed me a burner phone, a cheap flip model, and told me to keep it hidden and only use it to contact her in an emergency. I tucked it into the lining of my coat, next to my lock picks, and drove back to Meadowbrook feeling more powerful than I had in 6 years. While the investigation moved forward behind the scenes, I had one more thing to do. I needed to know, with absolute certainty, that no sliver of humanity remained in the people I was about to destroy. I needed a maximum cruelty beat, a test so stark that I could never look back with even a drop of guilt. I planned it for a Thursday afternoon in early February, when I knew all 4 of them, Charles, Margaret, Carter, and Victoria, would be home for a rare family dinner. I had prepared a manila envelope, a decoy, stuffed with blank paper and labeled in bold black marker, in a handwriting that looked like it could be official. "Paybridge Conveyance Original Docs Do Not Destroy." I had practiced the handwriting, a block lettering similar to Charles's, but with slight irregularities to avoid suspicion. The envelope was thick, padded, the kind that might contain legal documents. I walked into the main house through the kitchen entrance, the envelope clutched against my chest like a precious relic, and I made sure my face was pale, my breathing shallow and ragged. I had spent years in therapy after Danny's death, not just for grief, but for the kind of self-control that can simulate physical distress on command, a technique I had learned from a biofeedback specialist who taught me to slow my heart rate and dilate my pupils through controlled breathing. I could, with concentration, drop my blood pressure enough to make my skin clammy and my lips pale. I rounded the corner into the grand foyer, a cavernous space with a marble floor so polished it reflected the chandelier above, a chandelier that could have crushed a small car if it ever fell, and I let my body collapse. I went down hard, my knees hitting the marble with a crack that shot pain up my spine and into my teeth, and I let out a choked cry, a gasping, desperate sound that was half genuine from the physical impact. I clutched my chest with one hand, the universal signal for heart trouble, while the other hand, holding the envelope, stretched out weakly in front of me, the manila paper trembling in my fingers. I lay there gasping, my face contorted in what looked like agony, and I waited. I heard footsteps first, the sharp click of Victoria's heels on the marble, and then she was standing over me. Her face, when I forced my eyes open to look at her, was a mask of cold annoyance, not a flicker of concern in her expensive botoxed features. She looked at the envelope, then at my writhing form, and she did not bend down to check my pulse. She did not call out for Margaret or for doctor. She did not even pull out her phone. She simply stepped over my body, one Gucci pump carefully lifting over my outstretched arm, the other planting itself inches from my hair, and she snatched the envelope from my fingers. As she straightened up, she glanced down at me with an expression that I can only describe as utter contempt, and she said, in a voice that was completely devoid of warmth, "Get up, Lena, you're not dying. You're too boring to die." Then she walked away down the hall, already tearing open the envelope, her heels echoing into silence. A few seconds later, Carter appeared in the doorway to the dining room, a glass of single malt scotch in his hand, the amber liquid sloshing gently. He looked at me on the floor, looked at his wife disappearing, and said, in a tone that was perfectly casual, "Call an ambulance yourself if you need one. The staff is off tonight, and I'm not missing the rack of lamb." Then he turned his back, the dining room door swinging shut behind him, and I was alone on the cold marble floor, staring up at the crystal chandelier. I heard the clink of silverware from the dining room, Margaret's laugh at something Charles had said. I lay there for another 30 seconds, my heart pounding not from pain, but from a cold, crystalline rage, and I felt the last frayed thread of family loyalty inside me snap clean in half. I got up, brushed the dust from my knees, and walked back to the guest house. I washed my face with cold water in the tiny bathroom, looked at my reflection in the mirror, and saw not a grieving widow but an instrument of justice, sharpened by 6 years of patience and honed by months of meticulous evidence gathering. I was ready. The confrontation came 2 weeks later, on a bitterly cold morning in February, the kind of New England morning where the sky is a flat gray and the wind cuts through your coat like a knife. The bank had frozen the loan against the Pay Bridge shares. The FBI had secured warrants for Charles's office and for Carter's business premises, and the Whitfields were in full-blown panic mode, though they did not yet know I was the source of their unraveling. I had been feeding Agent Chen real-time updates about their movements, using the burner phone. I knew they were meeting with lawyers, trying to liquidate assets, but the bank freeze had trapped them like rats in a cage. Charles summoned me to his office, his voice trembling with an anger he could barely contain, and told me that there was a small administrative issue with the trust that required my immediate attention. He said we needed to go to the bank in Stamford, right then, to sign a simple release form that would unlock the funds so they could be distributed for Sophia's college fund, as he had always promised. The lie was so flimsy it was almost insulting. A cage made of paper and spit, but I nodded agreeably, my face slack and compliant, and I said I would be happy to help. I texted Agent Chen from the burner phone while I pretended to use the bathroom. "Going to Stamford commercial now. They're making their move." She replied instantly, "We'll be there." Stay cool. Charles drove us himself, a black Mercedes S-Class that smelled of leather and panic sweat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Victoria sat next to me in the back seat, tapping furiously on her phone, her face pinched with stress, while Carter sat in the front passenger seat, his jaw tight and his eyes darting to the side mirror as if expecting to be followed. Nobody spoke. I watched the bare trees slide past the window, their branches black against the gray sky, and I reviewed my plan one more time, mentally walking through the steps like a pre-flight checklist. I had a recording app running on my personal phone, tucked into my coat pocket, and I had memorized the exact language of the forgery statutes in Connecticut General Statutes Section 53, A139. The drive took 40 minutes, through the winding back roads of Fairfield County and into the commercial district of Stamford. Charles kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, His eyes narrowed, as if trying to calculate whether I suspected anything. I kept my face slack, my gaze distant, the perfect picture of docility. The bank was a grand old building on Main Street in Stamford, an imposing structure with marble columns and brass teller cages that harkened back to a more genteel era of finance. We were escorted by an assistant manager, a nervous young man with a too-tight tie, to a private conference room on the second floor, a windowless space with a long mahogany table, uncomfortable leather chairs, and a portrait of some long-dead bank president whose eyes seemed to follow me across the room. A lone officer I did not recognize, a portly man with a comb-over and a sheen of sweat on his forehead, sat at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of him. His nameplate read Gerald F. Haskins. Charles sat to my left, his leg jiggling under the table, and Carter to my right, his cologne overpowering in the close air. Victoria hovered near the door, her arms crossed, her expression one of barely controlled fury. Haskins slid a document across the polished wood toward me, a dense legal agreement with at least 15 pages and a signature tab flagged with a yellow sticky note that said "Sign here." I scanned the first page, my eyes moving quickly over the boilerplate, and I immediately recognized the game. This was not a simple release. It was a full ratification of the original stock transfer, a document designed to retroactively validate the forged signatures and make me legally complicit in the fraud. By signing it, I would be forfeiting any right to contest the transfer forever, and I would be personally liable for any taxes or penalties associated with the trust. It was a trap, laid with all the subtlety of a bear trap in a kindergarten classroom. I looked up at Charles, and he was smiling, that paternal mask back in place, his eyes crinkling at the corners in what he probably thought was a reassuring manner. "Just sign there, Lena," he said, his voice oily and soft, the voice of a man who believes he has already won. "And all your worries will be over. Sophia's future will be secure, just like Danny wanted." I picked up the pen they had placed in front of me, a heavy silver Mont Blanc, the same kind of pen Charles had used to sign the original forged documents. I twirled it once in my fingers, a small, deliberate gesture that made Carter's eyes narrow, and then I set it down on the table with a soft click. I looked Charles directly in the eye, and I said, in a voice that was clear and quiet, and carried the weight of 6 years of grief and rage and patient, methodical preparation, "I am not signing. The forgery is already on file with the FBI, the bank's fraud department, the Connecticut State Attorney's Office, and the SEC. The notary who backdated Danny's signature has given a sworn statement. The credit card accounts you opened in my name have been documented and provided to federal investigators. You stole from a dying man, you destroyed my credit, and you plan to have me declared incompetent so you could loot my daughter's inheritance. Now you are going to pay." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a faint electrical buzz that seemed to grow louder in the stillness. Charles's face went through a series of colors I had never seen on a human being, from a pale, ghastly white to a mottled gray to a deep, congested purple that made the veins in his temples stand out like cords. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Carter half rose from his chair, his fists clenched, his mouth opening to say something, probably a denial or a threat. But before he could, the door to the conference room opened and Diane Okonkwo walked in, her posture erect and her expression one of grim satisfaction. Behind her came 2 men in dark suits with badges clipped to their belts, FBI credentials visible, and a woman in a navy blazer who identified herself as Special Agent Sarah Chen of the New Haven Field Office. Behind them, faintly visible in the hallway, were 2 uniformed Stamford police officers and a woman I recognized as a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a tall woman with a silver brooch on her lapel. The room erupted into chaos. Charles started shouting about lawyers and civil rights, and this gold-digging little nobody, and you have no evidence, his voice cracking with panic. Victoria screamed something about her reputation and started frantically deleting things from her phone, which Agent Chen gently but firmly took from her hand, saying, "Ma'am, that's evidence tampering. Please step back." Carter actually lunged across the table to grab the document I had refused to sign, but one of the agents intercepted him with a move so smooth, and practiced it looked choreographed, a wrist lock that folded him over the table and left him gasping with his cheek pressed against the mahogany. Within 90 seconds, Charles and Carter were in handcuffs, their faces a study in shock and fury and the slow, dawning realization that their entire house of cards had collapsed. Victoria was led to a separate room for questioning, still shrieking about her lawyer and her rights, and the injustice of it all. Gerald Haskins, the loan officer, looked like he might be sick on the table, his face the color of old cheese, and I later learned that he had been a willing participant, earning kickbacks for processing fraudulent loans, and he would be charged alongside them. The last thing Charles said to me as they marched him out, his hands cuffed behind his back and his tailored suit rumpled, was, "You will regret this, you stupid girl. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I looked him right in the eye, and I felt no anger, just a vast, cold certainty. I said, "I have exactly the idea, Charles. I'm dealing with 2 felons who forged a dying man's signature and exploited a grieving widow. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner." Then he was gone, his protests fading down the corridor, and the room fell quiet except for the soft hum of the lights. Agent Chen put her hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll need your full statement, but you did good, MS. Vasquez. You did real good." The legal aftermath was a slow, grinding machine, but every single wheel turned in my favor. The FBI investigation, which had been building for months, uncovered a sprawling web of fraud that extended far beyond the pay bridge equity. Charles had been operating what was essentially a Ponzi-like scheme for years, using stolen assets to secure loans that he would then partially repay with new stolen assets. A classic robbing Peter to pay Paul strategy that had finally collapsed under its own weight when the bank's regulators started asking questions. The reconstructed, shredded documents I had provided were key evidence, showing the deliberate attempt to destroy incriminating material, and the USB drive from Danny's guitar case was the linchpin that proved duress, making the original transfer void ab initio from the very beginning. The notary, Patricia Drummond, turned state's evidence immediately when confronted, and she testified, under a grant of immunity, that Charles had paid her $10,000 in cash to notarize the signature after Danny's death, and that Carter had been present during the transaction and had helped her forge the date. Her testimony was devastating, delivered in a trembling voice that convinced the grand jury in less than an hour. I testified at the trial, walking the jury through every piece of financial evidence with the same calm, methodical precision I had used in 100 audits. I showed them the forged signature, the backdated seal, the credit card statements, the shredded email about the conservatorship. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Carter's lawyer tried to cross-examine me, suggesting that I was a bitter widow seeking revenge, but I had documented everything so thoroughly that his questions just reinforced my credibility. He asked, "Mrs. Vasquez, how do we know you didn't fabricate these documents yourself?" I replied, "Because the originals are in the FBI's evidence locker, and the metadata on the photographs proves they were taken inside Charles Whitfield's office on the dates claimed. You're welcome to request the forensic report." The lawyer sat down. In the end, Charles Whitfield pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of securities fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, to be served at FCI Odysville, and he was ordered to pay restitution of $4.6 million, an amount calculated by a team of forensic accountants who traced every dollar of the fraud and applied statutory penalties. Carter Whitfield was convicted at trial of aiding and abetting, conspiracy, and bank fraud, and he received a 7-year sentence at FCI Fort Dix. Margaret Whitfield escaped criminal charges by claiming ignorance, and her lawyers argued successfully that she was a victim of her husband's deception. But the civil forfeiture proceedings stripped her of every asset she had, including the Greenwich estate, which was seized by the bank to satisfy the outstanding loans, the Jaguars, which were auctioned off at a fraction of their value, and the country club membership, which was revoked under the club's moral turpitude clause, a small, petty victory that gave me a grim smile. Victoria filed for divorce from Carter within a week of the arrests, citing irreconcilable differences, and she relocated to Los Angeles, where she eventually rebranded herself as a lifestyle resilience coach and started a podcast about surviving toxic family systems, which I find to be a level of hypocrisy so breathtaking it almost circles back around to impressive. She now charges $500 an hour for consultations, and I sometimes wonder if her clients know she stepped over a dying woman to steal a fake envelope. As for me, the clawback order was a thing of beauty, drafted by a forensic accounting team at the U.S. Attorney's Office with my assistance as a consulting expert. My CPA credentials and my intimate knowledge of the financial trail made me an invaluable resource, and I spent several months working alongside the prosecutors, tracing the flow of funds and building the restitution schedule. The Pay Bridge equity, which had been valued at $300,000 when Danny died, had appreciated dramatically. 2 years after his death, Pay Bridge was acquired by a larger fintech conglomerate called Fidelis Global, and the acquisition valued the company at just over $200 million. Because the original stock transfer was declared void, the shares reverted to Danny's estate, and from there to me as the sole beneficiary and executor. The court awarded me the full current value of the shares, calculated at the point of the acquisition, plus statutory interest from the date of the fraudulent transfer, compounded at 8% per annum, as prescribed by Connecticut prejudgment interest statutes. The total came to $712,419, a figure that I can recite in my sleep. The credit card accounts they had opened in my name were closed and discharged, and the bank's insurance carrier paid a separate settlement of $200,000 for emotional distress and the cost of my legal representation, which I used to establish a college fund for Sophia, a 529 plan that I fund every month with the same automatic deposit that I used to use for our tiny Roth IRA. I did not get Meadowbrook, and I did not want it. I used a portion of the restitution money to buy a modest 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood in New Haven, a house with a fenced yard where Sophia can play, and a small office for me with a window that overlooks a maple tree. I painted the walls myself, using rollers from the hardware store, and I installed new locks on every door, high-security Medico deadbolts that would take even my father's skills to pick. I invested the rest in a diversified portfolio that I managed myself, a mix of low-cost index funds and municipal bonds, because some habits you never unlearn, and I checked the balance every month on the same spreadsheet template my mother taught me, with the same green ink columns. 6 years after Danny's death, I was hired as the chief financial officer of Fidelis Global, the very company that had acquired Pay Bridge. I did not get the job because of the tragedy. I got it because during the years of legal proceedings, I had built a reputation as a ferociously competent financial executive who could spot a discrepancy in a 10,000-line general ledger before breakfast, and who understood the intricacies of fintech, accounting better than anyone in the industry. The interview process was grueling. 5 rounds of conversations with the board and the CEO, a technical assessment where I had to reconstruct a deliberately flawed set of financial statements, and I passed with flying colors. I had rebuilt my career from the ashes, piece by piece, and by the time the offer came, I was ready. My office sits on the 42nd floor of a tower in Midtown Manhattan, with a view of Central Park if you crane your neck just right, and on my desk, next to the triple monitors and the Bloomberg terminal, I keep that little mahogany box. It holds the brass key, still in its piece of medical tape, the note from Danny, and a printed still frame from the USB video, his tired, loving face looking back at me from the screen. Every time I look at it, I remember what he wrote. "You can fix this." He was right. I fixed it with a lockpick, a camera, and the kind of relentless patience that only comes from having your whole world stolen and spending 6 years plotting to take it back, one audited line item at a time. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Put your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, the truth is always buried somewhere in the numbers, waiting for someone brave enough and thorough enough to dig it out. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that when family becomes a predator, the only solution is to treat them like any other criminal, with evidence, with a ledger, and with the absolute certainty that justice is not just an emotion, it is a balance sheet that must be reconciled. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.